Do you all not understand? I am a princess. Now get to work at once.
A long time ago, in the kingdom of Ejubud, there lived a princess named Adoni. She was the only child of King Bay and Queen Flat, the beloved rulers of the great Yoruba land. From the day she was born, she was treated with great care, like a precious treasure. The people of the kingdom adored her and often spoke of her beauty. They said she was as radiant as the morning sun, bringing light and warmth wherever she went. Her presence alone filled the palace with joy, and her parents cherished her deeply, knowing she was their greatest gift. But as Adoni grew older, something else grew within her: pride. She began to believe she was better than everyone else simply because she was born into royalty. She stopped showing respect to the elders, she made fun of the palace servants, and she ignored the struggles of the poor. "I am a princess," she would often say with pride. "The daughter of kings. Why should I humble myself before ordinary people?" The villagers sighed and shook their heads. In the marketplace, the women whispered to one another, "Beauty without kindness is like a drum that makes no sound." Adoni always made everything about herself. Whenever she was with friends, she would take over the conversation and turn it back to her own life. She wanted to be the center of attention at all times. She also had a way of manipulating people to stay in control, making sure she was always seen as the most important. She often looked down on her friends, acting as if she were above them. But deep inside, she was not as confident as she seemed. She was secretly insecure, and whenever someone questioned or criticized her, she would become upset and defensive. Even her parents, the king and queen, tried to guide her. "A true leader is loved, not feared," her mother often reminded her. But Adoni refused to listen. She brushed off their words, believing she already knew everything. One evening, an old woman arrived at the palace. She wore a faded wrapper and a gele that had seen better days. Her clothes made her look poor, but there was something special about her. Her eyes sparkled with wisdom. "Kobiyisi," the old woman said, bowing respectfully before King Bay, "your daughter is like a river that refuses to flow. If she does not learn humility, there will come a day when she cries for help, and no one will listen." Princess Adoni chuckled, folding her arms. "What can a poor old woman possibly teach me?" she scoffed. The woman only smiled and whispered, "A tree that refuses to bend with the wind will break when the storm comes." And with that, she vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. Not long after the old woman's warning, Princess Adoni was sent on a royal visit to the neighboring kingdom of Owegba. She traveled in a grand carriage, carried by the strongest palace guards. With her head held high and her royal beads clinking with every movement, she ignored the villagers who bowed as she passed, refusing to acknowledge them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky grew darker. Thick clouds rolled in, and a strong wind howled through the trees. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and an approaching storm. Then, boom! A deafening clap of thunder shook the earth. The horses neighed in fear, their eyes wide with panic. They reared up wildly, nearly throwing the guards off balance. The men struggled to steady them, but before they could, a flash of lightning split the sky. The carriage rocked violently. And then, crash! The next thing Adoni knew, she was lying on the cold ground, deep in the forest. She had been thrown from the carriage. Her royal beads were scattered, her fine royal gown were torn, and worst of all, she was completely alone. Lost and helpless. For the first time in her life, there were no guards to protect her, no servants to tend to her needs, no soft cushions or warm meals. She was just a girl in the wilderness, vulnerable and afraid. She pushed herself up and stumbled forward, her bare feet aching as they pressed against sharp stones and tangled roots. "Somebody help me," she cried, her voice trembling. But the only response was the distant hoot of an owl echoing through the trees. She wandered for hours, her stomach empty, her body shivering from the cold, and her heart heavy with fear. As Adoni wandered deeper into the forest, a flickering light caught her eye in the distance. Hope surged in her chest. She hurried toward it and soon found a small hut, smoke curling from a fire inside. Desperate, she ran to the door and knocked. An old woman answered. She wore a simple wrapper, her hands rough and wrinkled from years of hard work. Behind her stood a young girl, no older than 10, peeking curiously from behind her woman's skirts. "Who are you, and why are you knocking so late at night?" the old woman asked, eyeing Adoni with suspicion. Straightening her back, Adoni lifted her chin. "I am Princess Adoni of Ejibod," she declared. "I demand food and shelter." The old woman narrowed her eyes. "A princess, you say? And yet, here you stand in rags, with empty hands. What does a princess know of hunger?" Adoni opened her mouth to argue, but just then, her stomach let out a loud, embarrassing growl. The old woman frowned. Not only had this girl failed to greet her properly, but she also had the audacity to make demands in a home that wasn't hers. Without another word, she shut the door in Adoni's face. Out of pity, the little girl, Ife, who had been watching from behind her old woman, stepped forward. Though afraid, she ran to Adoni, wrapping her small arms around her in an attempt to comfort her. But Adoni shoved her away. She wrinkled her nose in disgust, taking in the girl's unkempt hair and worn-out clothes. "What a filthy little girl," she muttered, her voice filled with disdain. But Ife only smiled. Instead of getting angry, she looked up at Adoni and said calmly, "It doesn't matter who you say you are. If you do not learn humility, no one will help you here." Then, without another word, she turned and walked past Adoni, disappearing into the darkened street. Princess Adoni was exhausted and starving. She had walked a great distance, her feet aching with every step. Desperate to find her horse, she turned back toward the forest, hoping to retrace her path. But instead of finding her way out, she wandered even deeper into the dense woods, until she was completely lost. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. Spotting some wild fruits hanging from a tree, she quickly plucked a few and took a bite. But as soon as the bitter juices touched her tongue, it burned and irritated her mouth. Gagging, she spat them out. Weary and frustrated, she pushed forward along a narrow forest path. Then, in the distance, she saw another hut. Hope surged within her, and she ran as fast as she could toward it. She didn't bother to greet the villagers she passed along the way, nor did she introduce herself. When she reached the hut, she banged on the door impatiently. An old man with a walking stick slowly stepped out. His face was kind, but his body was frail. Without a single word of greeting, Adoni demanded, "Give me food." The old man studied her, his eyes filled with quiet pity. Though he could see she was arrogant, he still wished to help. He nodded and began to walk slowly toward his small hut, leaning heavily on his stick. But Adoni, tired and short-tempered, lost her patience. In frustration, she kicked his walking stick away. The old man tumbled to the ground. A gasp rippled through the village. People who had been watching the scene unfold rushed forward, their faces filled with anger. Instead of apologizing, Adoni lifted her chin and boasted, "Do you know who I am? I am a princess." But the villagers had seen enough. Furious at her disrespect, they shouted at her, chasing her out of their little community. Adoni's fine clothes were now torn and tattered. Her body was covered in dirt, and hunger gnawed painfully at her stomach. As she trudged through the darkening forest, she longed to find her way back to the palace. Then, in the far distance, she spotted a thin trail of smoke rising into the evening sky. Again, hope flickered within her. It was getting late, and she had nowhere else to go. Slowly, she made her way toward the small hut, her steps unsteady and weak. This time, when she reached the door, she knocked gently, no longer with anger, but with exhaustion and shame. The door creaked open. Standing before her was the old woman, the same one who had once visited the palace to warn her about her arrogance. Adonia's heart sank. She could barely meet the woman's gaze. Everything the old woman had said had come true. Now, here she was, lost, broken, and helpless. No one had been willing to help her. The old woman studied her for a long moment. She seemed to consider turning Adonia away. But before she could say a word, a small hand tugged at her arm. It was Ife. "Mama, let's help her," the little girl pleaded softly. She looked so tired. The old woman let out a deep sigh. "Fine," she said at last. "But here, we work for what we eat. If she wishes to stay, she must agree to spend 7 nights with us. After that, I will show her the way back to her palace." Adoni had no choice. She was too hungry, too tired, and too lost to refuse. Reluctantly, she nodded. The old woman allowed her to eat and rest for the night. But by morning, her true lesson began. For the first time in her life, Adoni had to carry a heavy water pot on her head. The cold water sloshed over the sides, soaking her clothes, but the old woman did not offer to help. She had to pound yam with her soft, delicate hands, her arms quickly growing weak from the effort. Sweat dripped down her face, and painful blisters formed on her palms. When mealtime arrived, the old woman placed only a small portion of the pounded yam fufu before her. Adoni stared at it in shock. "What is this?" she cried. "I am a princess. I should eat a full plate." The old woman met her gaze calmly and said, "Here, you eat what you work for." Humbled and exhausted, Adoni lowered her head and ate in silence. Days passed, and Adoni began to change. Each morning, she woke early to fetch firewood, her feet carrying her along the same paths she once would have ignored. She learned how to light a fire, how to sweep the yard, how to greet others with respect, and how to serve instead of demand. Slowly, her once proud heart began to soften. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Adoni sat outside the hut, watching Ife plait a little girl's hair with gentle hands. A question lingered in her mind, one she could no longer ignore. "Why did you ask Mama to help me?" Adoni asked quietly. Ife glanced up and smiled. "Because kindness does not ask who you are. It just gives." Tears welled in Adonia's eyes. She thought of all the times she had turned away from those in need, believing herself too important to care. Now, she understood. She had once been rich but poor in spirit, while these villagers, though having little, were rich in kindness. Then, one morning, the sound of voices and horses filled the air. A search party had arrived. The king had sent his best warriors to find his missing daughter. When Adoni saw the search party, she did not run to them like a spoiled child eager to be rescued. Instead, she turned to the old woman, her eyes filled with gratitude, and knelt before her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have given me something my palace never could, a true lesson in life." The old woman smiled knowingly and placed a gentle hand on Adonia's shoulder. "Go now, child. Rule with a heart full of wisdom." Tears streamed down Adonia's face as she turned to Ife. Without hesitation, she pulled the little girl into a tight embrace, and they wept together. "I promise I will send for you," Adoni said, holding Ife's hands. "You are my sister now." With a heavy heart, she finally rose and walked toward the warriors who had come to take her home. When Adoni returned to the palace, the entire kingdom gathered to see their lost princess. But she was no longer the same. Instead of riding in a grand carriage, she walked on her own 2 feet. Instead of dressing in her finest royal robes, she wore simple wrapper materials mingling with friends, just like the villagers who had once taken her in. And for the first time, As Adoni stepped into the palace, she did something she had never done before. She knelt before the elderly servants and greeted them with deep respect. Then, she turned to her parents, bowing low before the king and queen. With humility in her voice, she said, "I was blind to the struggles of my people, but now I see. A ruler who does not serve is not a ruler at all." The palace erupted in cheers. The villagers, who had once feared her pride, now rejoiced at her wisdom. Princess Adoni ruled with a heart full of understanding. She walked among her people, listened to their needs, and became the greatest queen Ejubud had ever known. With each passing day, she grew even more beautiful, not just in appearance, but in spirit. Her kindness shone through her every action. And true to her promise, she sent for the old woman and Ife. Her parents welcomed them with open arms, granting them a place to stay in a special wing of the palace. But to Adoni, they were more than guests, they were family. She continued to learn, to grow in empathy, and to rule with love. Under her leadership, the kingdom flourished beyond imagination. The end. Moral lessons. 1. Pride can lead to downfall. No one is too important to be humble. 2. A true leader must first learn to serve. Power is not about ruling, it is about understanding and caring for those you lead. 3. Kindness is the greatest gift. It is not riches that make a person great, but the goodness of their heart. 4. Life will always teach lessons, whether you listen or not. It is better to learn them before they humble you.
Once in a castle, tall in the sky, lived a princess who never asked why. Her crown was heavy, her jewels would gleam, but love was missing, or so it would seem. She'd parade through halls with her nose held high, hiding her heart away from the eye. Her subjects whispered low in fear, wishing her kindness would appear. Oh, princess, kindness shines brighter than gold. It's the warmth of a hand when the nights are cold. A crown may glimmer but can't set you free. Oh, princess, kindness is the key. One day a child with nothing to share gave her a flower with petals so rare. The princess froze, then started to see that true riches lie in humanity. She walked through the town, her jewels left behind, heart now glowing, soft and kind. The people cheered, their tears ran wild. The princess changed, now free as a child.